Today I'm going to look at a rebranding case study, and we're particularly going to look at this area called the Raval District in Barcelona, and how there has been some success, but also some things have been contested in the rebranding process. So we need to look at the location of the Raval District. This is the city of Barcelona. Here is the main port section, and this area here is the Raval District, which is separated into a north and south section, which have slightly different characteristics, which I'll show you on another map. So we need to know specifically why the Raval District needed rebranding. This was an area since the Industrial Revolution that was very industrial and polluted. This was because they had lots of textile factories, brick making and abattoirs that were packed into these tiny streets, which was very densely populated, because in this time people that would have been working in this area would have been living in these tenement blocks, which would have been close to the textile factories, and they would have been similar to what we've seen in other places like Glasgow. They would have been terrible conditions, pretty slum-like, and so this was an area particularly industrial and polluted, and had a lot of people. And that wasn't even before we look at the area that was the south of Raval. So the south of Raval, because it was so close to the port, which I've indicated out here, it became the first place that immigrants would arrive, and they would live in the kind of cheap housing around there. So it became known as the Chinatown, or Barrio Chino of the city. And because of this, because it's so close to that port, it became an area that got associated with in the informal economy, and particularly things like prostitution and other illicit activities like drug dealing. And this was, again, partly because it was close to the port, and therefore people like sailors would come in and they'd be looking to kind of find people to have sex with, and therefore it would lead to the kind of rise of prostitution. They were also looking for kind of having a good time, and therefore it led to kind of drug dealing and various similar petty crimes. So this area, the south area particularly, became an area that had a very, very bad reputation within the city. So there has been different approaches to rebranding in the north and south of Raval, and if I look up here in the north, I can see that there is flagship projects. So we have here the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Contemporary Cultural Centre just behind it there. And these are big flagship projects that have been built to kind of really show off the area as an area of culture. And these kind of places that got international reputation. And if we go down to a street level, we can see that this is an area that has had a lot of investment in terms of the wide open spaces. We've got bikes here for tourists. It's also the kind of places that they have art galleries and coffee bars and wine bars kind of in the streets around it. This is an area that is kind of associated with a higher social economic group of people. People that are wealthy would be coming to this area. So in the southern Raval, we have still conditions which aren't necessarily as nice as the kind of the north area. So if you have a little look on a kind of normal street in here, it's some of it's run down. There's still graffiti. This is an area that's well known for like having kind of prostitutes on it, and so some of the regeneration hasn't met this kind of southern area, but that doesn't mean necessarily that everywhere in the south has been under a lack of regeneration. This area here, this boulevard of trees, is actually in '95. It's called Raval Rambler. It's a kind of a nice boulevard full of trees, and they actually got rid of 1,700 buildings that they completely demolished and created this space to try and attract people into this area. They also built this avant-garde hotel, which is called the Barcel Raval Hotel. This is private investors. So we talk about players. This would be in a private investment, and this is a building that is supposed to show, it's another kind of flagship building to say that this area is changing. and it's supposed to show that the south has had investment as well. This is a slightly closer look at that place I was showing you just a second, called Raval Rambler. Again, it's a big open boulevard with trees on either side. There's shops, and there's kind of this is the hotel that they've invested into. But also here, as we talk about architects and urban planners having an influence, this is an artist that has made this kind of big statue, which is something that people come to have their photo taken in front of. And so it's an area that's supposed to encourage people to come and see it. And it's not like those tiny back streets, or, not the area that was seen as an industrial area full of prostitutes and drugs and illicit behaviour. As we've mentioned before, there can be often conflict and contest over rebranding, particularly between different players. One of the obvious things that's happened in the Raval District and Barcelona in general is there's conflict between tourists and locals. Most of the flagship developments like the museum have been built for tourists. These tourists are often wealthy, and so therefore bring a lot of money into the area, which can be good, but unfortunately it can actually mean that residents are actually excluded from the facilities and the rebranding that's actually been done. So lots of these museums have been built, but unfortunately lots of the local people can't afford to use them. Also, because wealthy tourists come to the area, it also means as they've got lots of money, they kind of raise the prices. That can be everything from restaurants to supermarkets. Again, this doesn't help out the local people who are often poorer. And so tourists can bring in money, but they can also cause problems in an area, and therefore the rebranding process is seen as conflicted. The other area of conflict you could also get is between actual residents of the city. So the Raval District is an area where we've seen gentrification. This is where we get wealthy people invading an area and doing it up. And that can be good in terms of it can bring money into the area, it can refurbish an area. But unfortunately, it does mean for those kind of the wealthy people that come in, they'll have different priorities and different needs. And these might not be the same as the people as the kind of long-term residents that have lived in the Raval for a long period. And it can mean that kind of property prices can go up, which means that some people get kind of priced up out of the area and therefore have to leave. It also means that kind of you can get pressure being applied to local residents, which means in terms of like landlords put pressure on them and say, we want to sell this property, and therefore you get these people forced out of an area essentially because they don't have enough money to live in that area. We saw this not just in the Raval district, but as we showed in that example before, in Brixton, where lots of white middle class people have moved in and done up the area, but unfortunately it's meant that the black community, the Caribbean community, has been gradually forced away from that, which means businesses related to that community close down, and it loses some of that cultural diversity. If it happens on a large scale, it can lead to kind of whitewashing of an area. So there has been some positives of the rebranding process in the Raval. Crime in general has gone down, employment has gone up in the area, and also kind of health benefits have gone up, less pollution being one of those particularly. However, we still need to understand that this is the sustainability of this kind of rebranding. So if I look here in this area, this is the Raval, that kind of yellowy area. And as it says on here, in terms of the family income, so household income, this is showing us, it's still one of the lowest in the city. And therefore still, even though there has been improvements, it's still one of the lowest in Barcelona, and therefore is still considered to be a relatively poor area. We can also see that within El Raval, there is this gap. As we've already said, that north-south divide, if I draw on this left gap, we can essentially split El Raval into north and south. And so the income being made in this north section is considerably more than this southern section. So we have a real kind of split in El Raval. Some bits are being renovated very nicely, and so the crime rates will go down and employment will go up. But that seems to be very much on a north-south divide. So this south area is still an area that is associated with drugs, the sex industry, and generally crime